Wednesday of March. My name is Sarah Rooker, and I'm the director of the Norwich Historical Society. And on behalf of the Norwich Public Library and the Historical Society, we welcome you tonight. First order of business, of course, is to turn off all your mobile devices if you haven't already. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council and is co-hosted by the Historical Society and the Library. It's supported statewide by the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Vermont Department of Libraries. And tonight's talk is specially underwritten by the Norwich Bookstore. And we're very happy to have the bookstore here tonight with quite a number of Katherine Paterson's books, and she'll be available at the end to do some signing for you. The Historical Society and the Library would also like to thank our sponsors, the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Mascoma Bank, and the Historical Society and Norwich Square Properties for helping to bring First Wednesdays to Norwich. Tonight, Tess Taylor is here from the Vermont Humanities Council, and she's going to introduce Katherine Paterson. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So it's really nice to be here again. I just really love it, and we're so grateful to the Norwich Historical Society and the Library for hosting our First Wednesdays programs. And I try to visit at least once a year, but we send other people too from the Humanities Council, and it's just wonderful to be here. So Katherine Paterson is the author of more than 30 books, including 16 novels for children and young people. She has twice won the Newbery Medal for Bridget Terabithia, a banned book, by the way, in 1978, and Jacob Have I Loved in 1981. The Master Puppeteer won the National Book Award in 1977, and The Great Gilly Hopkins won the National Book Award in 1979, and was also a Newbery Honor Book. For the body of her work, she received the Hans Christian Andersen Award in 1998 and the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award in 2006, and in 2000 was named a living legend by the Library of Congress. She's Vice President of National Children's Book and Literacy Alliance and is a member of the Board of the Trustees for Vermont College of Fine Arts. She's also an honorary lifetime member of the International Board of Books for Young People and an Alida Cutts lifetime member of the U.S. section USBBY. She was the 2010-2011 National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. As you may know, Katherine has twice had books featured in the Vermont Reads. In 2010, we read The Day of Pelican, and in 2018, we featured Bread and Roses 2, Katherine's fictional account of two young children navigating the famous strike in Lawrence, Mass., and then were sent to Barre, Vermont to stay with the foster family until it was safe to return home. Last year, I had the privilege of accompanying Katherine to Lawrence for the annual Bread and Roses Festival. On that day, Katherine was honored by the Bread and Roses Heritage Committee and was inducted into their Hall of Fame. And this was for her work helping a new generation to learn about that important strike. Katherine has 4 grown children and 7 grandchildren. She currently resides in central Vermont with her faithful and adorable dog, Pixie. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Paterson.
And Tess gets the medal for having to listen to me speak 4 times than most people in Vermont. So if I repeat myself, Tess, and you go to sleep, everybody just forgive her. She has to drive me home too, so she had to listen to me on the way up and on the way back, during supper, and now, and my hero, Tess Taylor. I'm delighted to be in Norwich tonight, and thank you very much for coming. I'm glad it's not snowing or sleeting or doing all the horrible things we've had done to us over the last couple of weeks, but anyhow, it's brave to come out at night in the wintertime, and I appreciate your doing that. I was asked to speak about a book that actually is my last published novel, and I will do that. It's called My Brigadier Seer. See that There are copies on the table. So I'll forego the commercial and get into telling you a little bit about why I wrote the book. My father lived in China for 18 years, but when I, in 1980, told him I was writing a novel set in China, he gave me an amused grin. Well, he said, they say if you're in China for a week, you can write a book. If you're there for a month, you can write an article. If you're there for a year, you might write a small pamphlet. But if you live there for 10 years, you can't say anything at all. Despite my father's wise words, I went on and wrote the book, Rebels of the Heavenly Kingdom. I'm sad to say he died before it was published, so I never got his review of the actual book. I've thought, however, about his words many times over the years, and I can imagine that same twinkle in his eye and gentle skepticism when I decided to write a book that became my Brigadista year. Now, I have to share a few facts to begin with. I was born in China, not in Cuba. I have at some point in my life been fluent both in Chinese and Japanese, and I have studied Latin, Greek, and French, but I'm still wandering in the wilderness as far as the Spanish language is concerned. I've lived for extended periods in 3 different countries and 7 different states, but I've never lived in Cuba. So why did I write a story set in Cuba? And even more, why have I written a novel about a 13-year-old girl from Cuba in the first person? After all, I'm an 87-year-old gringo living in Vermont. Some explanation is due to my departed father, if not to my prospective readers. Every book has its own story, and in this talk I'll be going back to the beginning of the story of this book in order to tell you how, despite my wise father's words, I wrote my Brigadista year. For 40 years, just a warning, none of my stories are short. You can ask me a yes-no question, and I will lean back and begin, once upon a time. So that's warned, here it is. For at least 40 years, I've been part of an organization known as the International Board on Books for Young People, or IBBY, I-B-B-Y. IBBY, as some of you probably know, was started soon after World War II by a German Jew named Jelle Leppmann. Jelle Leppmann had worked with and written for women and been the first woman to be editor of the Stuttgart main newspaper, amazingly enough. And before she fled Hitler's Germany to spend the war years dodging Nazi bombs in London. Soon after the war ended, she was asked by the American High Command to return to the American sector of Germany and work for the rehabilitation of women and children devastated by the war. As a Jew, she wrestled with the idea of living in Germany again, but she finally accepted the assignment. Ms. Leppmann was a woman devoted to peace, and children, she believed, were the key to building a peaceful world. Children don't start wars, but children are always the innocent victims of adult wars. She knew well that during the Nazi regime, German children were only allowed to read the propaganda materials put out by the government. Leppmann believed that these young victims of the war that they never started were not only hungry and ill-clothed, but that they were starving spiritually and intellectually. So soon after she returned to Germany, she began to collect books from all over the world for these children. Before long, she established a center where children could read and work and play together and learn through books about the lives of children in other countries. This center eventually became the International Youth Library in Munich. And in her firm conviction that children's books could become an instrument of international understanding and therefore a bridge to peace, Letman led the formation in 1953 of the International Board on Books for Young People. Currently, IBBY has sections in more than 75 countries, and every 2 years, at IBBY World Congresses, delegates eat and talk with persons from countries which their own governments consider unfriendly nations. But we're all there because of our concern for children and because we believe books can be a bridge across political, racial, ethnic, even religious divides. Every 2 years, there is a Congress in one of the member countries. My first IBBY Congress was in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1990, where I met and made friends from all over the world. I haven't been to every Congress since, but I have been to most of them. Every 2 years, member nations may nominate a writer and an illustrator to receive the IBBY's Hans Christian Andersen Medal for the body of their work. At the World Congress in New Delhi in 1998, I received the Hans Christian Andersen Medal for writing. The 1998 jury was made up of IBBY members from South Africa, Finland, United States, Bulgaria, Portugal, Slovenia, Chile, and Iran. To me, that jury was an overwhelming affirmation of the power of children's books to bridge divides most of the world would consider impossible to span. I can't remember at which Congress I first met the head of the Cuban delegation, Emilia Gallego. I do remember marveling that Cuba was there, as well as Iran, two countries that my own country officially despised. At some Congress, probably the one in Colombia, Emilia gave me a paper and said in highly accented English, "You must come to Cuba." The paper was in Spanish, so I had no idea what I was being invited to. I think I just smiled and nodded and went on my way. Fortunately, my Guatemalan friend, Patsy Aldana, translated Emilia's invitation for me and became our interpreter. So I was finally able to recognize Emilia as more than the mysterious woman who handed me papers that I couldn't read. As the Andersen Medal winner, I got a lot of international invitations that I was thrilled to accept. But how could I go to Cuba? I had the idea that if US citizens could even find a way to get into Cuba, they would be thrown into jail when they tried to return home. A Mennonite friend who seemed to go in and out of Cuba on a regular basis told me I should really go. "You go all the time," I said. "Aren't you afraid you'll be arrested?" "Oh, I'm just hoping they'll arrest me," Ken said. "I want to take the case to court and prove that the law is unconstitutional." "But Ken," I said, "you would do so much better in jail than I would." In early 2001, I was getting emails from Emilia urging me to come to her fall conference. By now, Ken had persuaded my husband, John, that we shouldn't miss the wonderful opportunity, and John was raring to go. But he'd spent several days in Alabama jail after the Civil Rights Movement. He knew what spending time in jail was like. I didn't. And he could speak a bit of Spanish. I couldn't. I called my friend Patsy Aldana, who married a Canadian and has lived in Toronto for many years. Amelia has invited me to her conference next fall, but I don't think we can get there from here. I'm going to the conference, Patsy said, so why don't you and John just come up to Toronto and we'll fly to Havana together. Still uneasy about the legalities of such a scheme, I called an office named, somewhat mysteriously, the Cuban Interests Section. I talked to a young man on the phone about our proposed trip to a literacy and literature conference in Havana. He seemed to feel that it was no problem. He assured me that U.S. citizens were permitted to go to Cuba for educational reasons. This was definitely an educational event. I hung up somewhat relieved, and John and I bought our tickets to Toronto and sent Patsy our money to buy tickets from Toronto to Havana. When we arrived in Havana during the first week of October 2001, there was hardly a foreigner to be found on the streets. The tourists from Canada and Europe didn't jump at a chance to board an airplane so soon after the events of September the 11th. But the Cuban people who were at the conference in our modest hotel and on the streets of the city welcomed us warmly. When they asked where we were from and we said the United States, their faces broke into smiles. It was plain that for most of the Cuban people we came to know, living was not easy. Whenever a mention of the government was alluded to, there was one name that was never spoken. A stroking of an imaginary beard let us know whom they meant. But there was music everywhere, and folks broke into singing and dancing like actors in old-time Hollywood movies. Of course, we saw the beautifully cared-for American cars of the 1950s. But the car our friend Amelia drove was not one of these. Just pray Amelia will not insist on driving us anywhere, Patsy said. But of course, Amelia did. Her car was an ancient Soviet-era Lada, more rust than metal. We had to get out and give it a push to get it started. And Amelia neglected stop signs to make sure it would keep going. We lived to tell the tale, but there were times when we seriously wondered. But Amelia's Lada was far from the most daring feature of her life. At every meeting, government representatives and members of the official press were lurking among the participants who had come from various Latin American countries, as well as Cuba. I was in the presence of a powerful, outspoken person. I asked Patsy, why isn't Amelia in jail? Patsy shook her head. No one knows why Amelia is not in jail, she said. I think it's because she has too many international friends. It might prove embarrassing to the regime to put her in jail. It was a wonderful week, ending with hugs and kisses on both cheeks, and then all too soon, we were back in Toronto and in the immigration line for our return to Vermont. The female agent who took our passports studied them suspiciously. I see you entered Cuba, I see you entered Canada, left the same day, and then re-entered a week later. Where did you go for that week? She asked, her finger on the blank page that Cuban immigration hadn't stamped, not wishing to get visitors from the United States into trouble. But alas, I am what the Japanese call baka hondo, which means fool honest. So I said, Cuba. The eyebrows went up. It's all right, I said. We were attending an educational conference. I produced the official-looking certificates in Spanish that Amelia had provided us with to prove that we had been in attendance. The eyebrows stayed aloft. I talked to Daryl at the Cuban interest section, and he assured us it was all right for us to go. She snatched up her phone. Is anyone there named Daryl? She asked. No, 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 I cried. Dwayne! I had not helped my case. She gave me a withering look and left the area to go into a back room to complete her conversation uninterrupted. We waited and waited and waited some more. Finally, she returned with our passports, stamped them a bit huffily, and handed them back into my shaking hands. So I said, putting on my bravest face, you're going to let us go home. Better than that, she said. I'm not going to fine each of you $40,000. Which I saw in the Times Argus a few weeks later was what they charged a 60-year-old Vermont woman who took an unauthorized bicycle tour in Cuba that fall. Fast forward to 2015. Amelia and I have now each other's email addresses, though both of us have to have a friend or relative translate most of the message. Anyhow, even I could tell that in that particular email, Amelia was inviting me to come the last week of October to speak to her biennial conference. A lot had happened since we'd been at the 2001 conference. Senator Leahy had become a hero to my friends in Cuba for his efforts to ease relationships between our two countries. Barack Obama had become President of the United States. Fidel Castro had died, and so had my husband, John. The Obama administration was beginning to ease restrictions on travel to Cuba, and there would be no trouble with immigration this go-round. We could take a flight from Miami rather than sneak out through Toronto. My son John speaks fluent Spanish and was eager to be my guide and companion on the trip. I wrote to Amelia and told her we'd be there. A few weeks before our scheduled trip, I ran into my friend Mary Leahy at an event at the State House. Oh, Mary, I said, I'm going to Cuba soon, and I was hoping I could get your brother to write a letter for me to read to the participants. He's such a hero to my friends there. So how could I contact him in time to get something before I leave? She said she'd introduce me to one of the senator's aides, who was also there. But before she did so, she said the thing that led to the writing of this book. She said, I'm so jealous. Pat gets to go to Cuba all the time, but I've never been there. When I began working with adult literacy in Vermont, I took ideas for our work from the great Cuban literacy campaign of 1961. I had never heard of it. Read Jonathan Kozol's Children of the Revolution, she said. It tells all about it. Needless to say, I immediately got hold of Kozol's book and then began further research on the 1961 literacy campaign. My favorite resource was a documentary filmed by Katherine Murphy entitled Maestra. In it, she tells the story of the campaign interspersed with interviews with 9 Cuban women who as teenagers were literacy volunteers. They all look back on the campaign as the year that changed their lives. Among them was a world-renowned architect, an urban planner, a translator, an artist, a college math professor, a teacher, an actress, a medical secretary, and a social psychologist who incidentally is a leading proponent in the struggle for the civil rights of Afro-Cubans and the LGBTQ community in Cuba. The story of the literacy campaign is a story very few people in our country know until it hit the headlines with our Senator Vernon, who dared to say that Castro had done something good, and it's very, very hard for us to believe there's any good in a person who has done a lot of evil. We want to see our heroes as spotless and our villains as having no good qualities whatsoever. So now more people have heard about the Cuban literacy effort of 1961. The story of the literacy campaign begins on the 31st of December, 1958, when Batista, the corrupt dictator of Cuba, resigned and fled the country, making way for Fidel Castro and his band of revolutionary fighters to take over the country. In the fall of 1960, Castro addressed the United Nations. And in that speech, he declared that in 1 year, Cuba would become a literate nation. Unlike most dictators, and Castro certainly was one, he believed that in order to build a strong nation, you had to have a literate citizenry. Back in Cuba, he put out a call for volunteers. If you can read and write, he said, you should teach someone else how. He got well over 700,000 volunteers, more than half of them female, and of that number, about 108,000 were between the ages of 12 and 18. My story is about those teenage volunteers. The young volunteers were called Conrado Benitez Brigadistas. Conrado Benitez was an 18-year-old literacy worker who was killed by counter-revolutionaries on January the 5th, 1961, just when the formal literacy campaign was being launched. They were called brigadistas because they were a uniformed army brigade, but they were carrying pencils and notebooks instead of weapons of war. Young Cuban girls who up until that time had lived sheltered lives in the city, being carefully groomed for proper marriages, left their comfortable homes and vigilant parents to go into the mountains and countryside where there was no electricity or plumbing, where they carried water from the river and scrubbed their laundry on the rocks of the river, and worked in the fields beside their hosts. And then at night, when the workday was over, sat with them under the huge lanterns provided by the Chinese government and taught the campesinos how to read and write. Lessons were erased daily from the slate, but never their names, which Luis always looked at longingly, night by night, until after he knew his vowels and consonants, indeed all the alphabet. I wrote his name in his workbook and suggested he practice copying it. Then came the night I erased his name from the slate and urged him to try his hand at writing it where I had written it 2 weeks before. The chalk was tight in his hand, and his tongue peeked out the corner of his mouth as painstakingly he wrote, for the first time, his own name for others to see. At the final A, he let out something between a gasp and a laugh. "You did it," I said. "You wrote Luis Santana." "I wrote my name," he said. "And my wife and my teacher can both read it, right? My name, Luis Santana. Now everyone who can read will know that I am Luis Santana. Wait, let me get my camera. I fetched my Uncle Roberto's camera from my rucksack. Now stand there. No, don't hide your signature. Stand a little to your left so I can see both your smile and your name. I've taken many photos since, but none I treasure more. In the midst of our celebration, there was a call from outside the door. We turned to see who could be visiting at this time of night. At some point during those first busy days, I had forgotten to be afraid of marauding insurgents, but I felt a chill at the call. Luis went to the door. It was the Acostas, all 4 of them. We have brought the women for the lessons, Daniel said gruffly. Everyone come in, Luis said. Everyone must see. He made no attempt to contain his pride. You must look here, he said, pointing at his signature on the slate. I can write my name. How wonderful, Nancy exclaimed. Now you can sign your name and not just your thumbprint. How do you know it means anything? Her husband said grumpily. It's just scribbling. No, said Luis, it's real writing. I know because I can read it. Look here, L-U-I-S, Luis, and S-A-N-T-A-N-A, Santana. Luis Santana. This is my name in letters, so that anyone who can read will be able to tell what it is. I can read it, said Veronica softly. Veronica's longer and harder, so, but you're practicing, I said. Soon you'll be able to write it on the slate for everyone to read. Did we come too late for the lesson? Nancy asked. No, I said. If Luis and Veronica don't mind a review, I can start the first lesson with you and your mother tonight. You and Joaquin should join, Luis said to Daniel. Laura's a good teacher. Daniel made a sound like humph. We'll wait outside for the women, he said, but then turned to his wife. But don't you be long. We have work to do tomorrow. Not only was life as a brigadista hard, it was also dangerous. First, there was the bombing, and then the US-backed invasion of the Bay of Pigs. It was quickly defeated, but the invaders who escaped fled to the mountains where they opposed the Castro forces, even threatening the peaceful literacy brigades. There had been no warning of danger. If not for the animals, we would never have known. We were in the back room as usual that Monday night. My thoughts by then were not on Maria's lost love life, whether real or imagined, or even her lack of poetic talent, but on my students. Nancy was busy writing and rewriting her letter. She had pushed herself to finish her exam because next month her baby would be born. Writing the letter was proving much harder for her than the rest of the exam. Castro said that everyone who graduated had to write him a letter. So they all had to write a letter to Castro to prove they could read and write. She was something of a perfectionist and could not tolerate a single erasure. Look, she said disgustedly, you can still see the mistake underneath. I need to do it over. It has to be beautiful if it is to go to Havana. Raphael was racing Daniel and his mother, determined to beat them both through the primer. And Daniel was just as determined not to let a 6-year-old triumph. I was beginning to have real hope that most, if not all of my students, would complete their 3 exams before December. I was working hard with Dunya, and Luis, as usual, was tutoring Joaquin. The elder Acostas had finally passed their 2nd exams, but were struggling with the lessons leading to the 3rd. Nothing but long words, Joaquin complained loudly. I can read the little ones, but now they're all as long as a water snake. I could hardly disagree. He'd gone from words like house and hill to words like industry and revolutionary government. A bit of a distance for an old man who had first met the alphabet just a few months earlier. And Luis broke the words into syllables and drilled the old man until he was nearly crying for mercy. But Luis was a stern teacher who wanted no pity. If you don't learn these words, you can't write your letter to Fidel, and poor Laura will go home feeling like a failure. Besides, he added, do you want your wife to finish first? Dunia's not letting the long words defeat her. Remember, our motto is, we shall prevail, not, we tried, but the words were too long, so we whined and gave up. But even if I learn the words you say, I have to make those little marks over some, but not all of the letters, and to put a little squiggle above the enye, the old man complained. That's too much for my old brains to remember. I guess those evil Spaniards invented all that as well. Yes, said Luis, I'm sure they did. But now they make good Cuban words. Besides, I think the marks and squiggles, as you say, are pretty. Would you want your language to look as dull and undecorated as North American English? I was almost beginning to think it was a good thing that Luis had broken his leg. He was such a help, and I knew I needed a lot of it if I was going to get all of them through the last test before the end of the campaign. We were deep into our lessons. Veronica was determined to pass her final exam before her son did, and I was in the middle of the dictation section when Luis suddenly said, hush. I stopped reading aloud and we all listened. The animals, he whispered. Something is out there. And then we all heard them. The chickens were cackling excitedly, the pigs were squealing, and even the oxen and goats were making anxious bleats. Luis grabbed a crutch, and as he struggled to his feet, whispered, douse the lamp, somebody. Daniel jumped up to obey. Luis pushed back from the table, shoved aside the blanket, and stumped his way into the kitchen. The animal protests grew louder. Then we heard shouting and a bam, bam, bam on the front door. Open up! We know you have a brigadista in there. For a moment we sat there frozen. Then Raphael let out a muffled cry. Mama! Veronica put her arm around him. Shh. The banging and yelling continued. Suddenly it was interrupted by Luis's voice. I will not open my door to criminals, but be aware that I also have a rifle, and if you banditos try to enter this house, you will not see another morning. I never knew Luis to own a rifle, but he was banging on the back of the door with something that sounded like the point of a gun. There was some muffled talking outside, and again Luis's strong voice. If you try to break in, just remember, I'm in the dark and you're in the moonlight. You won't see who's killed you until you reach the gates of hell. There were a few more half-hearted bams on the door, and then, we'll be back. There were more threats thrown back at the house, as apparently the insurgents drifted toward the woods. I heard in the distance the sound of a piglet squealing. When only the chirp of insects broke the silence of the night, Luis came back into the bedroom. Daniel relit the lamp and revealed Luis standing in the doorway with a broom in his hand. He dropped it and gave an embarrassed titter. I guess I can let go of my weapon now, he said sheepishly. For a long while, we sat silently around the table. Finally, Daniel stood up. It's safe to go, he announced, and we have animals to care for in the morning. We all went out to watch them go, peering anxiously toward the dark forest. When they disappeared into the shadows, we stepped back in, and Luis bolted the door. On her mattress, Isabel turned over with a sigh. I looked down. The little girls had slept through it all. Sleep if you can, Laura, Luis said. The animals will wake me if there's danger. It was a hot October night, and the air in the small back room was stuffy, but I lay shivering in my hammock, as cold as a fish on ice. From the woods, an owl screeched. I jumped. I won't be 14 until November 5th. I'm too young to die. I don't think I said the words aloud, but they were pounding as noisily in my head as if I had. I pulled my almost forgotten rosary out from under my nightdress and tried to smother my fear with a succession of whispered Our Fathers and Hail Marys. Dear Mother of God, don't let me die out here so far from my own mother. Even if they don't kill me, won't I be putting my beloved new family in danger just by being here? It's too hard. The thought hit me like a bullet in the chest. I had promised to go home when it got too hard. But the campaign ended, and when it did, the United Nations observers declared Cuba a fully literate nation. Today, Cuba's literacy rate is one of the highest in the world, being anywhere from 99.7 to 99.9%. The United States literacy rate was 84% in 2014 and hadn't changed in 10 years. I now knew what I wanted to say in my speech at Amelia's literacy conference for her Latin American colleagues. I had in hand Senator Leahy's letter to conclude my speech. But in the body of it, I would tell of my admiration and amazement for the young army of volunteers and the accomplishments of the campaign of 1961. It showed how the idealism of youth, when called into action, can accomplish great things. I emailed my talk to Isabel Serrato, who was to translate it into Spanish. In her return mail, she said, "You knew, didn't you, that Amelia was a brigadista?" I hadn't known. But when I did, it all made sense. She was one of the band of strong, accomplished women in today's Cuba whose lives had been changed by their experience as teenage literacy workers in the 1961 campaign. On our return from Cuba, I was excited to tell friends about the trip and about the literacy campaign that had changed the lives of so many. My friend Lita Schubert said, "You should write that story." Should I really? I spoke with my longtime friend Karen Lotz, who was then the publisher of Candlewick Books and is now CEO of the parent company, Walker Books. She encouraged me to write the story in novel form for young readers. So although I'm not Cuban, I decided to tell the story that until Bernie made it famous, few of us in the United States had heard of, and no one that I knew of was writing a book about it for the young. We all know the fact that Fidel Castro was a cruel and repressive dictator. We know that many Cubans have fled their homeland because of his actions, and many others suffered and died for opposing his regime. But perhaps we have not heard that under his leadership, Cuba became a fully literate nation in 1 year, a country where education is free from cradle to grave, in other words, from preschool through doctoral degree, and excellent medical care is available for everyone. We don't like to hear good stories about our enemies, but perhaps we should. As Laura says in the epilogue to her story, my country is not perfect, but then is yours? With fear and trembling, I sent a draft of the manuscript to Amelia and Isabel, and I was, to say the least, heartened by their replies. I'd like to think my father would have been as well. "My dearest Katherine," she wrote, "at last, and thanks to Isa's translation, I've been able to calmly read your novel, giving it the attention it deserves. I've been excited by your perception of a reality, of an experience which was like that, just as you have described it, caring, complex, adventurous, and profound. which undoubtedly can only come from the best place which each person has. I think that if I hadn't read everything you've written, and which was translated to Spanish, or if I hadn't had the privilege of hugging you and listening to you on more than one occasion, it would have been very difficult for me to understand how someone who wasn't there and who didn't go through that experience, the most beautiful one of my adolescence, has been able to capture the feeling that moved us, and which was no other than the detachment and essentially the surrender, a selfless act of love. In January of 1961, Fidel Castro launched the Year of Literacy. In that same month, a young American president spoke these memorable words: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Ironically, both men were set on a course that meant it was more than 50 years before our two nations exchanged ambassadors again. But in his own way, each inspired a generation of young people to unselfish action on behalf of others. The Cubans remember the literacy campaign. We remember the Peace Corps. When Congressman John Lewis spoke in Vermont last year, he was asked if he was pessimistic about the state of our country. "I'm optimistic," he said. "How can I be pessimistic when I see all the causes young people have taken up? Causes for gun safety, the environment, and equality for everyone, no matter what their race, ethnic background, immigration status, gender might be. I see what young people are doing, and I'm filled with hope." I can't tell a reader how to read my books. It is up to each reader to decide what meaning, if any, the novel holds for him or her. But of course, I cannot deny a wistful hope that some young persons today, on reading Laura's story, will be inspired by what these Cuban teenagers accomplished in 1961, and join young people from our own country and around the world to give themselves to selfless acts of love. And in so doing, they may discover that they have received more than they gave. As one brigadista has said, "I taught the campesinos how to read and write, and they taught me how to be a person." And I thank you.
Katherine would be happy to take some questions. I'm going to repeat them so everybody can, and she can hear them. And so, do we have any questions? Yes.
Are you aware of the current controversy about the novel American Dirt, which concerns the controversy is about a white woman having written about Latino culture? And if you are aware of it, do you have any?
I could not be aware of it, believe me. And I was aware of it before I wrote it. When I talked to Katherine, who's my editor, about it, I said, would it be crazy, knowing how many people would be unhappy if I did so, if I wrote a book about the literacy campaign? I said, I was thinking about there are wonderful pictures from the campaign, sort of a picture storybook telling the story of the campaign, nonfiction. And she said, Katherine, I can hear the excitement in your voice. I think it should be a novel. And of course, I've written some nonfiction, but I really prefer to write fiction. And I knew there'd be a backlash. I mean, I understand there are good reasons. And that's one reason I read you Amelia's letter, because I thought, well, if Amelia thinks I've done it right, then I'm not going to feel apologetic about doing it. Because I do think it's a very important story, and it needs to be told. Nobody who's Cuban has told it. I mean, in this country. Of course, in Cuba, it's very well known. There's a museum dedicated to the literacy campaign, and they consider it one of the great things that's happened in their history.
Yes?
So just to be clear, has your book been published in Spanish, translated and published in Spanish?
It is currently being, yes, it's going, a Mexican company is publishing it in Spanish. Amelia is determined that it be published in Cuba, but they don't have paper. They have this embargo, which means that there are a lot of writers who can't publish because they can't get paper. So whether it'll be published in Cuba or not, but at least it'll be in Spanish and it can be read.
But it can be published and printed in someplace in Cuba?
Can it be sold in Cuba?
I think so. It'll be, and Russia and China have jumped on it, which I found also kind of interesting. But it's already in Italian. It's going to be, and I haven't seen the Spanish copy yet, but I know that it's being published in Spanish, and it's just been bought by Russia and China. And I do have an Italian copy if anybody is interested. There's this, to go back to your concern, there's a real feeling that I mean, I think the wording is cultural appropriation, that you should not write out in somebody else's culture. I've lived in a number of cultures, and I would hate to feel that I could only write about 87-year-old people living in an old folks' home in Vermont, which is my culture right now. I think part of the concern is because people feel that the culture is not respected by people outside the culture, or not understood by people outside the culture, which, and a lot of bad books have been written. And I don't want to be one of the people who writes one, which is one reason I sent it to Amelia and Isabel to ask them to please.
Yes, I want to make clear.
My Cuban friends asked them to please.
Not a place of concern, but a place of interest about the question, and I quite agree that it can be done well and can be done not well.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote, my first 3 books were set in Japan, and I didn't know then I was not allowed to write about Japan. And then I wrote one set in China, and I was still ignorant about the fact that I couldn't write about China, even though I'd lived in both of those cultures. But I was not Japanese American, I wasn't Chinese American. Since there's been so much controversy, I haven't written them. I wrote about Kosovo because it seemed to me important for us to know about refugees that come to our country. I had, my story was affirmed by a woman who had been through those experiences. So you have to be willing to do a lot of research, and you have to be willing to learn, and you have to be willing to be corrected, and you have to be willing to be fussed at for doing it.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, after spending all this time and putting your heart into this novel, what were your thoughts when this became the national news this week?
what were your thoughts when this became national news this week?
Well, my son was thrilled because he's trying to sell the movie rights. But I was very interested, and you saw the backlash, didn't you? Yeah, I didn't vote for Bernie, I'm sorry, folks. I voted for Joe, but I like having Bernie as my senator, and I do like him being outspoken about things like that and not being afraid to say, you know, some good things have come out of our enemy territory.
Yes.
The fact that you grew up in China and so many other writers seem to have grown up in other cultures, it seems to me that maybe as an outsider, you're capable of looking at culture in a different, having a different perspective. Maybe there's a sense of being an observer because this isn't where you start.
So as an outsider from a culture, you have the ability to be an observer, maybe see a little bit more?
Well, I don't know. You know, I'm sure I've got horrible blind spots, and I hope.
I see this as a good thing. I've noticed that many writers have grown up, have been children in other countries, and it gives them a perspective that I think that other people would not have. And I also believe the fact that you have such incredible characters and that you understand human nature, and that really it doesn't matter what culture you come from, it's the basic person that's in you that matters, and that's why you can write so well about them. But you know, if you look at Pearl S. Buck, she's the obvious other person who grew up in China and then became this writer. And I'm at the age where I can't remember all the other writers that I know grew up as children of.
Yeah, I think you're on to something. If I heard most of what you said, maybe I'm sorry, I'm very hard of hearing, as you might have guessed. But somebody asked me why so many writers, and they began naming them, the list. Grew up in China, and these people all are writing in English. And I said, well, I think if you grow up, if you're bilingual from birth, it does good things for your brain. But you know, that's just, and I think that's probably scientifically correct. Because you know, there's so many other things happening there, and also when you come to this country, then you're an outside observer. You definitely are not an American when you come, having lived many years in another country. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much for a wonderful.
Yeah.